This podcast discusses the human immunodeficiency virus and may not be suitable for children. Please visit www.unaids for more information. But do you think you have seen sort of a positive shift since you were diagnosed?
Now, he did use a condom every time, but unfortunately one failed. I've been diagnosed for 32 years now.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention? We will be shortly starting the podcast, which has more viewers in the room right now than it ever will on YouTube, which is currently 0.
So a question I ask all of my guests to start with is, who are you and what do you do?
Okay, well, my name's Emma Cole, and I go around schools across the UK delivering education on HIV and AIDS.
Okay, so are you living with HIV, or do you just do it for just to raise awareness for it?
No, I am a person living with HIV. I've been diagnosed for 32 years now, so more than half my life, and I've been speaking very openly about it since I was diagnosed in 1991.
Okay, could you go into a bit of like the backstory, sort of, what it was like to find out, how you got it, if that's something you're comfortable sharing, etc.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Well, I contracted HIV through a sexual relationship. My partner, Ian, at the time, knew he was HIV positive, but sadly didn't tell me until a condom failed. Back in the 1980s, early 1990s, the safer sex message was to use condoms to prevent HIV transmission. Now, he did use a condom every time, but unfortunately one failed. And I spoke to a helpline and they said there was a very small risk that I might have contracted HIV from that failure. And sadly for me, that's what happened. I got tested 3 months later because you have to wait a certain period of time because your body has to produce the antibodies that the test would look for. Yeah. And so I got my diagnosis on September the 11th, 1991, just after I'd graduated from university.
I've got sort of two questions from that. Like, what is the actual test to, find out if you have it or not? What does that actually involve?
Well, you can either have a blood test done at a sexual health clinic, or now there are actually oral swab tests you can do at home, which would just be done either, like on a gum swab. Yeah. Those would then be sent off to the company, and if it were to show a positive result, it would then be followed up with a blood test to confirm it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it looks for the antibodies that are produced after someone becomes infected.
Okay. So what was it for you to find out? Because I assume you got called into the doctors or health clinic or...
Well, I'd gone for the test. So I went in at, say, 9 o'clock in the morning, I think it was back then. You went in and they took a sample of blood, and then you were waiting all day and you go back at 5 o'clock for the results. So it was a counsellor who gave me the results. And then the next day I met with the doctor for the first time. And all I remember was him telling me that if I was lucky, I might live 8 to 10 years with HIV. Because obviously back in 1991, we did not have treatments. So the prospect of living a long and healthy life with HIV didn't exist back then. Whereas today, if you were diagnosed with access to treatment, you will live a normal life expectancy.
So there is treatment for it nowadays?
Yes, we have medications called antiretroviral drugs. They're not a cure, but if you're able to access them, and here in the UK we can, then they suppress the virus and allow your immune system to not be so damaged by being HIV positive.
Okay. So have you ever undergone treatment for it?
Yes.
I assume so, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I wouldn't be here talking to you today if I didn't have my meds. Now, in the early years, someone like me didn't get treatment straight away. Today, you would. And I've been on treatment consistently now for about 15 years. And now I just take 2 pills once a day. Some patients will be on 1 pill once a day, some maybe a few more. And even now we have new things called injectable treatments. So some patients will have an injection every 3 months, 2 or 3 months, I'm not sure which, I'd have to remember. And that would be their treatment rather than taking pills every day.
Is there any like benefit to getting that over the pills, or is it just like personal preference?
I think it's personal preference, and also someone like me who's considered what they say now a long-term survivor, because I've been through a lot of the earlier drugs, I probably wouldn't be eligible for the injectable treatments. Whereas someone newly diagnosed who's never been on the pills, that might be an option for them.
Yeah. Do you still have to be like sort of like checked up for it at all?
Well, I go to the clinic every 6 months just for a sort of check in with my consultant. They obviously have to do regular blood tests twice a year just to make sure that everything that should be right is right. Obviously, some of the medications can cause issues with other parts of the body, like kidneys and liver. So they're always keeping an eye on things like that. And most importantly, what happens when you're on treatment is something called your viral load gets reduced to undetectable levels. And that's really critical, because if you're undetectable, you can no longer transmit the virus to a partner. So there's zero risk now if you're undetectable on treatment. So the sort of 6 monthly check-in very much wants to know that I'm still undetectable.
Does that happen for like, everyone eventually, or is that?
Yes, everyone on treatment, if they stick to their pills and take them every day like we're prescribed, then 99.9% of patients will get an undetectable viral load within 6 months. And as long as you stay on your medications, you stay undetectable. They call it undetectable, untransmittable, U equals U for short.
So if you stop with the medication, it like comes back?
Yes,
goes above the level.
If you stop the treatment, then your viral load will start to rise again. And yeah, you could then potentially put someone else at risk of contracting HIV.
Okay. So going a bit more general with HIV and AIDS, how do you think like the public awareness has changed for it in the UK or more globally over the years?
Well, I mean, there is a lot more access to information now, of course. When I was diagnosed in 1991, the internet didn't exist. So you only had information through support groups or your hospitals, whereas now obviously you can just get online and find way more information. I think we still have a long way to go to overcome the stigma that exists around HIV. And I don't know if you're aware, but Friday, December the 1st was World AIDS Day. And that's a global event to raise awareness of HIV. And, you know, I looked out that day to see how many people were wearing a red ribbon, and I only saw 3. So it's still something that not a lot of people are kind of aware of or supporting the cause. So I think we still have a long way to go to get the general public understanding HIV as it is today.
But do you think you have seen sort of a positive shift since you were diagnosed, that people are becoming more aware and like aware of the details behind it?
I'd like to think so, but actually I think out there in the general public, I think people's attitudes and understanding of HIV are very much back from the 80s or 90s. So, you know, you do still have people worried about shaking hands or giving someone a hug, where, as we know, there's absolutely zero risk from those sorts of activities. I think if you're working in the HIV sector, if you know someone who's HIV positive, you probably are a little more informed. But I think out there in the wider world, there's still a lot of ignorance and myths about HIV.
Yeah. What do you think the best way to educate the general public is, the everyday person? How do you think you should like teach them about proper like HIV practices and sort of just make them aware about it?
Well, obviously, I've taken it upon myself to be very public about living with HIV, and obviously thanks now to social media, I can be very open and reach a wider audience. I recognized very early on that I thought HIV was somebody else's problem, but actually this is, you know, predominantly everybody's problem, because it's sexually transmitted, and therefore, you know, unless you're choosing never to have sex, you could potentially sort of come across a partner with HIV. I think all I can do is my little bit, which is share my positive voice talks around schools. And, for each person who hears it, they may share my story with someone else. And obviously doing things like your podcast is a great opportunity to reach an audience I probably would never have come in contact with. So I think it's all about getting the information out as wide as possible. And hopefully that dispels some of the myths and stereotypes. And if we can get everyone understanding HIV as it is today, that will help all of us, to reduce the stigma.
Yeah. So I read on your website, so let me just get you've spoken to over 350,000 young people.
Yes.
That's quite a very impressive number.
Well, I've been doing it quite a few years now, Jacob.
But how important do you think it is for survivors to share their stories rather than just people talking about it? Just because they care about it?
Well, I think that first-hand experience obviously is ultimately the best way of educating, because lived experience is obviously something you can't replicate by just reading a textbook or watching a movie or something. Yeah. But obviously there are allies who do HIV education work as well, and their contribution is equally valid. But I think for me personally, sharing lived experience is the most important, because for me as a long-term survivor, I've got over 30 years of HIV history behind me, and I think it's important that history is not forgotten.
So what do you hope that someone, so a young person, say as a 15-year-old in one of your talks, what do you hope that they take from it, hearing your story?
Well, firstly, I hope they realise that HIV isn't particular risk groups' problem. It's not a gay disease. It's not just drug users who need to be concerned about it. I like to think, as a white heterosexual woman, I'd break down a lot of those stereotypes. And I think probably most importantly today for me, it's understanding this undetectable, untransmittable message, because I think a lot of the fear around HIV comes from the fact people think, oh my God, I might catch it. But what we now know, as I said, is if you're on treatment and you're undetectable, there is zero risk. And I think if that general message got out to a wider community, then a lot of the fears would dissipate and hopefully be eradicated.
Yeah. So moving on to fundraising and then kind of following on that general public awareness. In 2017, you ran the London Marathon.
I did. I always said if I survived to year 26 of life with HIV, I wanted to run the marathon, because I like numbers, and I thought 26.3 miles, 26 years HIV positive. I thought that would be a great sort of tagline for fundraising. And I helped set up a charity called Body and Soul, and they had one place for London Marathon in my 26th year. So they very kindly gave that to me. I think I raised about £4,500. And yes, I ran the marathon, and I will never do it again. It was quite something, but it was also a sense of achievement to actually do it, because a few years earlier I'd been very sick with pneumonia, and I'd been on oxygen in hospital, and I could barely walk for the next 6 months afterwards without getting out of breath. So to take on the challenge of a marathon and actually finish was quite impressive.
Incredible,
for me,
yeah.
personally.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
So the charity you mentioned, Body and Soul, as you helped to set that up, do you still do work with them or work for them?
No, I don't work for them now. Obviously, it was in the early years, it focused very much on HIV causes. But in more recent years, they've expanded their remit to help other people with mental health issues, people who have, been at risk of suicide and things like that. So although they still have their HIV core element, they do help other people now. So I don't do any work for them directly. But obviously, I'm always willing to support them, because they were one of the important charities in my early years.
Yeah. What does that actually entail them with their HIV causes? What does that actually look like for them?
Well, Body and Soul provide a range of services to people with HIV. So they have, support groups where you can go and meet people. They run courses that help people come to terms with their diagnosis. They have groups for children who are living with HIV. Because obviously, if you're a teenager or a young person who's been diagnosed, that's often a very challenging thing to share with people at school or your teachers. So they provide that support to young people with HIV. And yeah, they help with things like benefits advice and all that sort of thing, because a lot of people living with HIV may not feel able to work while they're coming to terms with their diagnosis and stuff. So there's a whole range of social support they provide to people.
If someone is diagnosed with HIV, what is like one bit of advice you'd give, or something you'd want to tell them, like I don't know, the day they find out?
Oh gosh, well, I know for me personally, the most important thing I found was meeting other people with HIV quite soon after I was diagnosed, because I think in the moment you probably feel like you're the only person who's ever had that diagnosis.
Yeah.
And I think, a lot of HIV clinics now, for a newly diagnosed person, they can put them directly in touch with a peer mentor, which is someone who is HIV positive, who's based in a clinic and can give that one-to-one advice straight away. And I think probably meeting someone else with HIV in the early days after diagnosis is really important, because you realize you're not alone, and you realize, here's someone living a well and healthy life that perhaps in the moment you might think you've lost forever.
Was that peer mentoring thing available when you were diagnosed?
Not in the clinics, but I was able to go to a support group called Body Positive, and they had actually had a youth group as well. So I met young people with HIV within the first week after I'd been diagnosed. And there was a young man with haemophilia in that group who had been infected through contaminated blood. And he had been known he'd been positive since he was about 8 years old. And he was going off to university. And he gave me a huge amount of inspiration, because I thought, wow, he hasn't let HIV stop him do the things he loves. So that really helped me to see that possible future for myself.
Yeah, I think that's probably just about wrapping us up there. So thank you very much for coming on.
You're welcome, Jacob. I hope it helps. And if any of your listeners want to follow me on social media, it's at Emma Cole HIV on Instagram and Twitter.
Of course, the link will be in the description of the YouTube video as well, if they want to click on that. But yeah,
Thank you
very much. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.